My name is Celia Moore. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my life, I have been described with words like steady, practical, and the reasonable one. I live in Portland, Oregon. I work in healthcare administration. I pay my bills on time. I return phone calls. I show up. People tend to underestimate women like me. I'm not loud. I don't interrupt. I don't fight to be the center of the room. In family photos, I'm usually slightly off to the side, smiling, but not drawing attention. Growing up, that role felt natural. My older sister was vibrant, decisive, and magnetic. I was the quiet one, the fragile one, especially after I got sick. 10 years ago, I nearly died from kidney failure, and my sister saved me. That is the part everyone remembers, the heroic headline. She donated her kidney. She was praised, admired, and celebrated. There were church prayers, community fundraisers, and grateful speeches. I was the recipient of life. She was the giver. What no one talks about is what happens after the applause fades, because what began as a gift slowly became something else. Something transactional, something conditional, a quiet, lifelong debt that I never agreed to sign. Over time, the narrative shifted from, "I'm glad you're alive," to, "You're alive because of me." And then, 10 years later, after our father passed away, my sister looked at me across a polished oak dining table and calmly declared that my entire inheritance belonged to her. That's my house, my savings, my share, my future. Because in her words, my life belonged to her first. This isn't a story about revenge. It isn't about screaming matches or dramatic courtroom theatrics. There are no villains twirling moustaches, no miracle plot twists, just slow realizations, quiet documentation, boundaries drawn without shouting. It's about what happens when gratitude is weaponized. It's about the difference between a gift and a leash. And it's about the moment I understood that surviving an illness did not mean surrendering ownership of my existence. I won't exaggerate what happened. I won't dramatize it for effect. I'll tell you exactly how it unfolded, the small comments, the subtle expectations, the things I ignored for years because I believed love meant tolerance. I used to think strength looked like sacrifice. Now I know sometimes it looks like a calm refusal. Have you ever felt indebted to someone in a way that slowly erased parts of you? For most of my life, I was the second miracle. Not the loud one, not the one who organized the family vacations or commanded attention at dinner parties. That was my sister, Lauren. She had a way of filling a room without trying. People gravitated toward her certainty, toward her warmth, toward her ability to make decisions quickly and confidently. I was the careful one. When we were children, I read instructions before assembling toys. I followed the recipes exactly. I raised my hand in class and waited to be called on. Lauren would speak first, correct later. I would think first, speak rarely. By the time I was 26 and my kidneys failed, that dynamic was already deeply ingrained. Lauren was strong. Lauren was capable. Lauren was decisive. I was fragile. Illness has a way of shrinking you in other people's eyes. Even before the transplant, I became something delicate in the family narrative. Conversations lowered when I entered rooms. Plans were adjusted around my energy levels. Every decision felt like it had to consider me, and I hated that. I didn't want to be the caution sign in everyone's life. When Lauren announced she was a match and would donate her kidney, the story was cemented permanently. She was the hero. I was the reason. People said it with tears in their eyes. You're so lucky to have a sister like her. She gave you life. You owe her everything. No one meant harm. They were expressing gratitude on my behalf. But over time, those words formed something solid inside the room, something structural, like a beam placed across the ceiling that could never be removed. At first, I agreed with them. I owed her everything. Didn't I? The surgery was successful. Recovery was long but stable. I went back to work. I rebuilt my strength. I rebuilt my stamina. I rebuilt my career. Eventually, I became director of administration at the very hospital network that had overseen my transplant. People called my story inspiring, but inside the family, I became something quieter. The one who had to be reasonable. The one who couldn't risk stress. The one who shouldn't upset Lauren. The one who needed to remember. At family dinners, if Lauren wanted to go to a restaurant, we went there. If she needed help moving apartments, I rearranged my schedule. If she vented about work, I listened longer than I wanted to. It wasn't that she demanded obedience outright. It was assumed that everyone would give it. And I did. Not because she forced me, but because I believed gratitude required softness, compliance, endurance. When Dad would joke, "Lauren saved your life, kiddo," he'd say it affectionately, with pride, as if he had raised two daughters, one brave, one blessed. I smiled every time. What no one seemed to notice was how often my preferences disappeared in small ways, how often decisions tilted in her direction without discussion, how often my silence was interpreted as agreement. I wasn't resentful. Not then. I told myself this was balance. This was fairness. This was the natural weight of what she had done for me. If I worked late to help her review mortgage paperwork, that was gratitude. If I loaned her money without asking for a timeline, that was gratitude. If I absorbed sharp comments when she was stressed, that was gratitude. I was alive. What right did I have to complain? Looking back now, I understand something I couldn't see then. No one explicitly told me I was smaller, but everyone, including me, behaved as if I was. And when a role is repeated long enough, it begins to feel like identity. I became the careful sister, the accommodating one, the quiet echo to her louder certainty. What I didn't realize was that roles, once assigned, are rarely surrendered voluntarily. And one day, someone would test just how much of myself I was willing to trade in the name of gratitude. The first time it shifted, it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a joke. We were at a family barbecue about a year after my transplant. The kind of summer evening where the air smells like charcoal and citronella candles. I had finally regained enough stamina to stand for more than an hour without needing to sit down. That detail mattered to me, even if no one else noticed. Lauren was telling the story again. The story. The hospital room. The phone call when she found out she was a match. The dramatic pause before she said yes. Everyone leaned in. They always did. And I just thought, she said, smiling, wineglass in hand, well, I guess I'm keeping her around. Laughter. Then she added lightly, she's basically my property now. More laughter. It was said with a grin. A playful nudge to my shoulder. A wink. I smiled too. But something inside me flinched. Not because I thought she meant it. Not then. It was clearly framed as humor, affection disguised as teasing. The kind of comment families make when they're comfortable with each other. Still, the wording stayed with me. Property. It's a strange word to use about a person you love. Later that evening, while clearing paper plates from the patio table, one of our cousins leaned toward me and said quietly, "You better be extra nice to her forever." She meant it kindly. I nodded, of course. And that was it. No argument, no confrontation, no scene. Just a small cut. In the months that followed, the joke returned in different forms. When I disagreed with her about a vacation rental, "Careful," she'd laugh. "You wouldn't want your kidney revoked." When I forgot to call her back one weekend because I was buried in work. "Wow, this is the thanks I get." When I chose a restaurant she didn't love. I guess I didn't donate taste buds. Always smiling, always playful, always positioned as humor. And every time I smoothed it over. I told myself she had earned the right to joke. She had sacrificed something permanent. She had scars too. Maybe this was her way of coping with the enormity of it. But humor has a pattern. Real jokes don't need repetition to land. These did. I began noticing how quickly other people deferred to her in subtle moments. If a group decision stalled, someone would glance at her and say, "What does Lauren think?" If I offered an opinion that contradicted hers, the room shifted slightly. Not hostile, just hesitant. As if disagreement felt inappropriate. As if tension around her was dangerous. As if I, of all people, should be the last to challenge her. Once, during a family holiday dinner, I mentioned I was considering applying for a position in Seattle. It would have been a promotion, more responsibility, a bigger role. Lauren went quiet for a moment. Then she said, softly but clearly, "You shouldn't move that far away from me." I laughed lightly. "It's only 3 hours, just almost only 3 hours." She met my eyes. "You wouldn't even be alive without me." The table fell silent for half a second. Then someone changed the subject. No one addressed what she had just said. Not her tone, not the implication, not the assumption that my geography should orbit hers. I felt heat crawl up my neck. Not anger, not yet. Embarrassment. Because I suddenly understood that what she had said wasn't meant for me alone. It was a reminder to everyone at the table. A recalibration of roles. I was alive because of her. Therefore, proximity was loyalty, agreement was respected, compliance was gratitude. I didn't push back. Instead, I heard myself say, I was just thinking out loud. That night, lying in bed, I replayed the sentence over and over. You wouldn't even be alive without me. It was factually true. But facts can be used as anchors or as chains. I told myself I was being sensitive, that she didn't mean it that way, that families say complicated things when history is involved. And maybe that was true, but it was the first time I realized something subtle. The narrative of my survival no longer belonged entirely to me. And once a story stops being yours, you have to decide how much of it you're willing to carry. The strange thing about small cuts is that they don't bleed loudly. They don't demand attention. They become background noise. After that dinner, I didn't confront Lauren. I didn't journal angrily. I didn't call a friend to dissect the moment. I simply adjusted. That's what I was good at. Adjusting. When she made a joke about checking on her investment, when asking about my health, I smiled. When she introduced me to someone new and said, "This is my sister, my greatest accomplishment," I laughed lightly and let it pass. When she told co-workers at a party, "She owes me big time," I clinked glasses and nodded. It was easier than tension, easier than being the ungrateful sister, because that was the unspoken fear, wasn't it? That any pushback from me could be interpreted as entitlement, as forgetting, as minimizing what she had done. So I internalized it. If she was sharper on certain days, I assumed stress. If she dismissed my opinion, I told myself it didn't matter. If she interrupted me mid-sentence, I decided the story probably wasn't that important anyway. The human mind is very good at preserving stability, especially when gratitude is involved. I started pre-editing myself in conversations. If I sensed disagreement forming, I softened my phrasing before it even left my mouth. If I wanted something different, I asked myself whether it was worth the emotional friction. Most of the time, it wasn't. Lauren began making larger decisions without consulting me, assuming I would align. Vacation dates, holiday plans, even conversations about how we would eventually handle our parents' estate. "Don't worry," she once said casually. "I'll make sure everything's handled fairly." Fairly. The word lingered. Fair to whom? I had a successful career by then. I managed budgets larger than our family's entire estate. I negotiated contracts. I oversaw compliance reviews. In boardrooms, I spoke confidently and directly, but at family gatherings, I became quieter. There's something deeply disorienting about being competent everywhere except the place you grew up. I remember one afternoon at my apartment. Lauren had come over unannounced. She walked through the space slowly, commenting on the decor, the layout, and the neighborhood. "It's cute," she said, "but you should probably buy something closer to Closer to me eventually. I like it here," I replied gently. Gently, she shrugged. "I just think after everything, it would make sense." After everything. 3 words that ended discussions before they began. I started noticing how often that phrase surfaced, as punctuation, as leverage, as insurance. And I began doing what I always did, rationalizing. Maybe she needed reassurance that her sacrifice mattered. Maybe she feared losing relevance in my life. Maybe this was her way of staying connected. So I stayed accommodating. When she needed a co-signer temporarily, I signed. When she asked for financial help during a business venture, I transferred funds without asking for paperwork. When she criticized a decision I made, I listened longer than necessary. Not because she demanded obedience outright, but because I feared what disagreement would imply. Gratitude, I believed, required ongoing proof, and proof required submission. The truth is, nothing she did during those years was explosive enough to justify a dramatic confrontation. There were no screaming matches, no explicit ultimatums, just a steady normalization of hierarchy. She had given, I had received, therefore she led, and I followed. It's unsettling how easily the mind adjusts to imbalance when it's wrapped in love. What I didn't realize was that every time I chose silence to preserve peace, I was reinforcing a structure that would one day stand against me. Because once someone grows accustomed to being deferred to, they don't notice the weight they're placing on you. They only notice when you stop carrying it. There's a moment in every long imbalance where it stops feeling temporary. For me, it happened quietly, during something as ordinary as paperwork. Our father had invited both of us over one Saturday afternoon to get organized. He was healthy then, sharp, practical, the kind of man who labeled file folders in neat block letters. He wanted to review insurance policies, retirement accounts, and the will. It was responsible, boring, necessary. Lauren arrived late, breezing in with apologies and energy. I was already seated at the dining table, documents sorted into categories. I had brought a legal pad, a pen, questions written neatly in the margin. Dad looked relieved when he saw me. "Celia's already got this under control," he said warmly. Lauren laughed. "Of course she does. She's the administrative genius." It sounded like praise, but then she added, "That's why I don't worry. She'll handle all of this when the time comes." I glanced up. "All of what?" I asked lightly. "You know," she said, waving a hand. "The paperwork, the logistics, the boring stuff." Dad chuckled. "Your sisters are right, you're better at details." There it was. Not cruel, not malicious, just assigned. Lauren would be the emotional center, the spokesperson, the one who talked to the extended family, the visible pillar. I would be the engine room, quiet, efficient, invisible. As the afternoon unfolded, it became clearer. When legal terminology came up, everyone looked at me. When decisions required discussion about values or sentiment, they looked at Lauren. She spoke about preserving family harmony. I spoke about tax implications. She talked about fairness in emotional terms. I calculated percentages. At some point, Dad turned to her and said, "You'll make sure everything stays balanced, right?" And she answered without hesitation, "Of course." I realized then that balance in their minds didn't require my voice. It required my cooperation. Later that evening, as Lauren and I loaded dishes into the sink, she nudged me playfully. "See, this is why we work," she said. "You handle the structure, I handle the people." I dried my hands slowly. "And what do I handle for myself?" I asked, half smiling. She blinked, as if the question hadn't occurred to her. "You don't have to," she said finally. "I've got you." It was meant as comfort, but it felt like containment. Over the next few years, that division solidified. During the holidays, I organized travel schedules. I tracked expenses. I mediated between vendors and venues. Lauren made speeches, proposed toasts, chose themes, received praise. If extended relatives needed updates about my health, she delivered them, even when I was sitting right there. "She's doing great," she'd say. "I keep an eye on her." I didn't need monitoring, but I allowed it, because it was easier to let her narrate my life than to interrupt the story. The role was simple. She was the reason I was alive. Therefore, she was the steward of that life. I was the responsible one, the reliable one, the proof that her sacrifice had paid off. And somewhere along the way, I stopped asking whether that equation was sustainable. Roles become dangerous when they're mistaken for identity. I wasn't fragile anymore. My labs were stable, my stamina had returned, my career was thriving. I had purchased my own home without assistance, built my own savings, made my own medical decisions. But in the family ecosystem, I was still the recipient, still the one who owed, still the sister who should be grateful first, independent second. And the most unsettling part, no one forced that role onto me. I stepped into it willingly, because I believed love required it. I didn't yet understand that love without boundaries becomes ownership. And ownership, once normalized, rarely shrinks on its own. The shift didn't happen during a fight. It didn't happen when Lauren made one of her jokes. It didn't happen when someone deferred to her opinion instead of mine. It happened on a Tuesday morning in a hospital corridor. I was reviewing quarterly compliance reports when one of our transplant coordinators stopped me near the elevators. She was new, early 30s, sharp, still carrying that idealism that hasn't yet been worn down by bureaucracy. "We have a donor-recipient pair meeting today," she said. 5-year anniversary. I smiled automatically. "That's always meaningful." She hesitated. "It's complicated, though." I tilted my head. "How's it so?" "The donor has started pressuring the recipient. Financial stuff, emotional leverage. We're advising boundaries." Her words were clinical, measured, confidential. She wasn't sharing names, just a pattern. But something inside me went very still. "Is that common?" I asked carefully. "More than people realize," she replied. "When someone gives an organ, the gratitude dynamic can get distorted." Distorted. That word followed me into my office. For the first time in 10 years, I allowed myself to consider something radical. What if what I'd been calling gratitude wasn't entirely healthy? I sat at my desk, staring at the silver medical bracelet around my wrist. The engraving caught the light, the date of my transplant. I had worn it every day since the surgery. It was my reminder to protect my health, to stay vigilant, to honor the second chance. But suddenly, I saw something else. I had never once considered that Lauren and I might need boundaries around the transplant. I had assumed the sacrifice created a permanent moral hierarchy. But what if it didn't? What if a gift could be sacred and still finite? That afternoon, I pulled up my own transplant paperwork. Not out of suspicion, but curiosity. Consent forms, psychological evaluations, donor agreements. Every document emphasized the same principle: voluntary, no coercion, no expectation of compensation. The transplant had been framed, legally and ethically, as a gift, not a contract. There was no clause about lifelong obedience, no appendix outlining emotional repayment, just medical risk disclosure and consent. I leaned back in my chair and felt something unfamiliar. Not anger, clarity. For years, I had been responding to implication rather than reality, to narrate rather than document. Lauren had given me an organ. She had not purchased my autonomy. The realization wasn't explosive. It didn't trigger immediate confrontation. It didn't even change my behavior that day. But it planted something steady. A line. For the first time, I separated two truths that I had always merged into one. I can be grateful, and I can still belong to myself. That night, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror and studied my scar. The faint, pale line along my abdomen. It had faded over the years. It was part of me now, but it didn't define my shape. Neither did the debt. I whispered something I had never allowed myself to say before. My life is mine. Not in defiance, in recognition. And once that sentence settled into place, everything that followed began to reorganize quietly around it. Nothing changed on the surface immediately. Lauren still joked. Family dynamics are still tilted, roles still existed. But inside me, something had shifted from reflex to awareness. Silence was no longer automatic. It was becoming a choice. And choices, once conscious, have consequences. After that Tuesday, I didn't confront Lauren. I didn't announce a boundary. I didn't deliver a speech about autonomy. I simply began observing. There's a difference between silence born of fear and silence born of strategy. I had lived in the first for years. Now, I was experimenting with the second. The next time she made a joke about her kidney, I didn't laugh immediately. I let the moment breathe. We were at brunch with friends. Not family, but people who didn't know our history intimately. Lauren had just finished recounting the transplant story for the table. And now, she said lightly, tapping her glass, I basically get lifetime loyalty. The group chuckled politely. Instead of smoothing it over, I took a sip of my coffee and said calmly, it was a gift, not a contract. My tone wasn't sharp. It wasn't defensive. It was matter of fact. Lauren blinked. The table went quiet for half a second. Then someone asked about the menu, and the conversation moved on. It was small, almost imperceptible, but I felt it. For the first time in years, I hadn't reinforced the narrative. I hadn't apologized for existing. I hadn't softened the moment to protect her comfort. I had simply corrected the framing. Lauren didn't confront me afterward, but I noticed something subtle in her expression during the rest of the meal. A flicker of recalculation. Over the next few weeks, I made other adjustments. When she asked me to review a stack of documents for a side business she was launching, I said, I can look at one or two sections, but I don't have bandwidth for all of it. No explanation, no elaborate justification, just a limit. She paused longer than usual before responding. Wow, busy these days. I am, I replied evenly. Silence followed. She wasn't used to hearing no from me, especially not a calm one. The important thing was that I didn't fill the silence. I didn't rush to reassure her. I didn't backpedal. Silence, I was learning, can be a boundary if you let it stand. But boundaries often look like rejection to people who benefit from your flexibility. Her tone shifted gradually, more pointed, slightly colder. When we discussed holiday plans and I declined to host, she said, I guess you've changed. Yes, I said quietly, and I have. That word seemed to unsettle her more than any argument would have, because change implies awareness, and awareness threatens hierarchy. Family members began noticing the difference too, though they couldn't articulate it. My mother once asked gently, is everything okay between you girls? Everything's fine, I answered. And it was. There were no fights, no accusations, no dramatic scenes, but the dynamic had shifted from unconscious compliance to conscious participation. Lauren started testing the edges more directly. One evening, she called and asked for a small favor, co-signing a refinancing arrangement. The numbers were significant. The risk was real. In the past, I would have agreed before she finished explaining. This time I said, I'm not comfortable doing that. A long pause. After everything, she asked softly. There it was, the phrase. But instead of shrinking, I let the words hang between us. Yes, I said. No anger, no elaboration. Just truth. The conversation ended politely, but I could feel the tremor beneath it. What she mistook for weakness for years had quietly become resolve. And resolve doesn't argue. It simply stands. I knew then that this shift would not go unnoticed forever. The more I held steady, the more friction would build. But something inside me was no longer afraid of that friction, because for the first time, my silence wasn't a surrender. It was alignment, and alignment has weight. When people think of preparation, they imagine confrontation, speeches, documents slid dramatically across tables, a decisive declaration. That's not how it began for me. It began with a folder, a simple encrypted digital folder labeled Transplant Personal Records. I didn't create it out of anger, I created it out of clarity. If silence was now a choice, I wanted it to be informed. Over the years, I had kept every medical document, partly out of habit, partly out of professional instinct. Now, I began organizing them with intention. Consent forms, psychological evaluations, donor agreements, follow-up letters. Every page reinforced the same ethical foundation. Voluntary donation, no coercion, no obligation beyond medical aftercare. I wasn't looking for ammunition. I was grounding myself in reality. At work, I discreetly refreshed my knowledge of transplant ethics policy. Not through gossip or breach of confidentiality, just through continuing education modules available to administrative leadership. I read case studies. I reviewed guidance from ethics boards. Patterns emerged: gratitude distortion, emotional indebtedness, family power imbalances post-donation. It had a name. It wasn't rare. That knowledge alone steadied me. At the same time, I began reviewing something else quietly: our family's estate structure. After Dad's organisation afternoon years earlier, I had kept copies of the will draft he'd shared. I revisited it now, not because I expected conflict, but because I understood something fundamental. Unspoken expectations become spoken demands under pressure. If Lauren believed moral hierarchy translated into financial entitlement, I needed to understand exactly where the legal line stood. I scheduled a consultation with an estate attorney, framed as a routine personal planning session for myself, which technically it was. I wanted my own will updated. My healthcare directives are clear. But during that meeting, I asked neutral questions. How does beneficiary distribution interact with perceived moral obligations between siblings? The attorney raised an eyebrow slightly, then answered clinically. It doesn't, she said. The law recognizes documentation, not emotional narratives. Documentation, not narrative. I wrote that down. At home, I began separating finances more cleanly. Any informal loans I had given Lauren in the past, I documented retroactively with written summaries, not to demand repayment, but to create clarity, dates, amounts, context. When she texted casual requests for money, I responded through email instead. Politely, professionally. The shift was subtle, but paper trails changed tone. She didn't notice immediately. Why would she? I had always been the reliable one, the detail-oriented one, the quiet engine room. My increased organization looked like consistency, not defense. That was the advantage of being underestimated. People rarely suspect the person who manages spreadsheets of planning anything beyond efficiency. Meanwhile, I strengthened something less tangible: my emotional independence. I reconnected with friends I had unconsciously sidelined over the years. I expanded my routines outside of family obligations. I traveled alone for a weekend, something I hadn't done since before my illness. The first evening away, sitting in a small coastal rental overlooking the Pacific, I felt something unfamiliar. Lightness. Not because Lauren wasn't there, but because no one was narrating my existence. No one was reminding me of the origin story. I was just a woman watching waves, and that perspective changed everything. When you widen your world, power imbalances shrink. Back home, I continued observing. Lauren's comments grew slightly sharper as my compliance decreased. She asked more questions about my finances, my investments, my savings. In the past, I would have answered fully. Now I smiled and said, I have it handled. Which was true. What she never noticed was this: I wasn't building a case against her. I was building a foundation under myself. And foundations don't make noise while they're being poured. But once they set, they hold. The discovery wasn't dramatic. There was no hidden clause buried in the paperwork. No secret recording, no explosive confession. It was quieter than that. It happened 6 months after Dad passed away. Grief changes the temperature of a family. It lowers tolerance. It exposes fault lines that were previously cushioned by routine. Without him as the steady center, Lauren's tone sharpened. Mine steadied. The will was clear. Assets are divided evenly between us. No conditions, no symbolic gestures, just percentages and signatures. Lauren didn't object immediately. At first, she framed everything as logistics. We should consolidate accounts. It'll be easier if one of us manages distribution. I can oversee things and make sure it's fair. Fair again? I listened carefully. Equal division is already fair, I replied. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. A week later, she invited me over for dinner. The oak dining table, the same one where Dad had once organized his paperwork. She poured wine. She spoke slowly. I've been thinking, she said. Given everything, it doesn't make sense for us to split this evenly. There it was. Not shouted, not angry, just stated. I didn't react immediately. I let her continue. I gave you life, she said gently. Dad knew that. We all know that. Morally, it's not equal. Morally. That word was doing a lot of work. I'm not asking for all of it, she added quickly. But the majority, it's only fair. And then she said the sentence that would echo for months. Your life exists because of me. So what comes from that life should reflect that. She wasn't joking. There was no smile, just expectation. In that moment, something inside me crystallized. Not outrage, recognition. This was the logical endpoint of years of subtle reinforcement, of jokes uncorrected, of hierarchies unchallenged, of gratitude stretched past its healthy limit. She genuinely believed the organ created ownership. And here was the private reveal. I wasn't shocked, because I had already prepared for this possibility. I had documentation, legal clarity, independent financial structure, a personal estate plan that protected my assets, written records of every loan, every transfer, every agreement. More importantly, I had internal clarity. Her claim wasn't emotional manipulation in disguise anymore. It was explicit. That made it easier to address. I looked at her across the table, really looked at her. Lauren didn't see herself as greedy. She saw herself as balancing a moral ledger. And for years, I had allowed that ledger to exist. I'm grateful for what you did, I said calmly. But my inheritance is not payment. Her jaw tightened. It's not payment, she insisted. It's acknowledgement. I held her gaze. It was a gift. The word landed heavily. For a brief second, I saw something flicker across her face. Not anger. Not yet. Fear. Because if it were a gift, then it couldn't be reclaimed. If it were a gift, then it didn't entitle her to future claims. If it were a gift, then my life was not collateral. That was the moment I understood something clearly. This wasn't about money. It was about control. And control, once questioned, reacts. I left that dinner without arguing, without raising my voice, without making threats. But as I drove home, I knew a line had been crossed. Not by me, by her. And once a demand becomes explicit, silence is no longer neutral. It becomes a decision point. After that dinner, Lauren didn't call for 3 days. That was unusual. We had always maintained at least surface-level communication. Logistics, check-ins, updates. Silence from her wasn't emotional distance. It was a calculation. I didn't chase it. Instead, I reviewed my options. There were several. I could concede partially. Offer a larger percentage to keep the peace. Frame it as generosity. Maintain the appearance of unity. I could escalate legally. Send a formal notice through an attorney preemptively. Establish boundaries in writing before she makes a move. Or I could do something quieter. I chose the irreversible option. Not dramatic, not explosive, but permanent. First, I finalized the estate distribution exactly as written in our father's will. No delays, no informal side agreements. Every transfer is documented through official channels. Second, I separated something I had never fully separated before: access. Over the years, Lauren had become accustomed to knowing my financial landscape. Rough savings numbers, investment strategies, career trajectory. I had shared it casually, as siblings do. That stopped. I moved primary accounts to an institution she had no connection to. Updated beneficiary designations. Tightened privacy settings. Removed her as secondary contact on non-medical forms where it wasn't required. Nothing aggressive. Just clean lines. Third, and this mattered most, I scheduled a mediated conversation. Not to argue, to clarify. Through a neutral estate mediator recommended by my attorney, I sent a simple email. I believe we need a structured discussion regarding expectations around Dad's estate. I value our relationship and want clarity moving forward. No accusation, no reference to her demand, just clarity. She responded within an hour. Is this really necessary? Yes, I wrote back. That was the decision. I was no longer going to manage conflict privately to preserve her comfort. If she wanted to attach moral conditions to financial inheritance, it would need to be spoken in front of a third party. Silence had been strategic until now. Now it has become structural. The mediation session was scheduled for 2 weeks later. During that time, her tone shifted again. Shorter texts, cool politeness, occasional pointed remarks about how formal everything had become. I didn't react. Inside, I wasn't anxious. I was steady. Because the irreversible part wasn't the legal positioning. It was internal. For the first time in my adult life, I had chosen my autonomy over harmony. And once you choose that, you can't unchoose it. The night before the mediation, I stood in my living room, looking at the framed photo of Lauren and me taken the year after my transplant. We were both smiling, arms linked. Hospital bracelets are still visible. I touched the edge of the frame. Gratitude and ownership are not the same thing. I could love her. I could honor what she did. And I could refuse to be claimed. The next morning, I walked into that mediator's office not as the saved sister, not as the indebted one, but as an equal heir. And that distinction was everything. The mediator's office was smaller than I expected. Neutral walls, a round table, no raised voices, no dramatic atmosphere, just structured conversation, the kind that forces language to be precise. Lauren arrived 5 minutes late, composed, polished, confident. She greeted the mediator warmly, then glanced at me with something unreadable. We sat. The mediator began with simple ground rules, clarity, respect, and no interruptions. Lauren spoke first. I just think fairness needs to reflect reality, she said calmly. Celia wouldn't even be here without me. Dad understood that. It seems obvious that distribution should acknowledge it. Hearing her state it formally, in a professional setting, stripped the sentimentality away. It sounded different, transactional. The mediator turned to me. Celia? I folded my hands on the table. I'm deeply grateful for my sister's donation, I said evenly, but it was a voluntary medical gift. Dad's will is legally clear. I don't believe gratitude converts to financial entitlement. No heat, no sarcasm, just language. Lauren's posture stiffened slightly. It's not entitlement, she corrected. It's recognition. The mediator nodded neutrally. Recognition can take many forms. Are you suggesting a renegotiation of the will? Lauren hesitated, because that was the crux. The will was not ambiguous. There was no clause referencing the transplant, no language indicating adjusted shares. To argue otherwise required stepping outside the document, into moral territory. And moral territory is harder to defend when recorded. Over the next hour, the conversation circled the same point in different words. Lauren framed it as a balance, as symbolic equity, as an acknowledgement of sacrifice. I framed it as consent, as autonomy, as legal clarity. The mediator asked a question that shifted everything. If the transplant had not occurred, would you be requesting a larger inheritance? Lauren didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched. No, she said finally. Then the request is directly tied to the donation, the mediator asked. Yes, she replied. There it was. Clear. On record. The session ended without agreement. But that wasn't the goal. The goal was documentation. In the weeks that followed, I completed the estate distribution exactly as outlined. Funds transferred, property titles updated, tax filings submitted. Lauren sent one more email suggesting we revisit the division privately. I replied once. I'm not revisiting legally executed documents. Short, polite, final. Then something subtle began to happen. Extended family members, who had casually assumed Lauren would manage everything, started contacting me directly about their portions of shared heirlooms and logistical details. My calm presence during mediation had travelled quietly through the family network. Not as gossip, as credibility. Lauren couldn't frame me as unreasonable without explaining her request. And explaining it exposed its premise. She didn't escalate legally. She couldn't. There was no contractual basis. Instead, she withdrew. Communication thinned. Invitations slowed. Holidays became separate plans for now. And through all of it, I didn't react publicly. I didn't defend myself at gatherings. I didn't announce what had happened. I let the structure speak. Because once boundaries are formalized, you don't need to argue them repeatedly. You just uphold them. From the outside, nothing dramatic had occurred. Two sisters, an estate divided. Life is moving forward. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had shifted. The hierarchy was gone, and when someone has built their identity around moral superiority, losing that position feels like a loss, even if nothing tangible was taken from them. The consequences were beginning, quietly. The consequences didn't arrive as a confrontation. They arrived as an absence. Lauren stopped calling casually. The spontaneous weekend brunches disappeared. Group chats grew quieter. Invitations to events she hosted began including a subtle phrase at the bottom. Let me know if you can make it. Not can't wait to see you. Just neutral. At first, the extended family didn't know anything had happened. They only sensed a temperature change. At Thanksgiving, we arrived separately, sat at opposite ends of the table, polite, functional. No one asked directly, but everyone noticed. I didn't explain. I refused to weaponize narrative the way it had once been used on me. If Lauren wanted to tell her version, she could. I would not compete. Still, small ripples formed. An aunt pulled me aside one evening and said quietly, "You seem steadier." It surprised me. Steadier than what? I asked. She smiled faintly. Than before. That was when I realized something important. When you stop orbiting someone else's gravity, people feel the recalibration. Lauren, meanwhile, began expressing her dissatisfaction in subtler ways. Comments about loyalty, observations about how money changes people, occasional reminders in mixed company about how she had always put family first. They weren't direct accusations, they were atmospheric. But atmosphere influences perception. One afternoon, she called unexpectedly. Her voice was controlled. "I just want you to know," she said, "that this whole thing has been disappointing." "I understand," I replied. "That's it?" she asked. "I'm sorry you feel disappointed," I said evenly. She exhaled sharply. "You don't think I deserve something extra?" There it was again. Not about legality, about deserving. "I think what you did was extraordinary," I said, "and I will always honor it. But I don't believe extraordinary acts create permanent ownership." Silence. "Then you've changed." "Yes," I answered. The line went quiet. When someone expects guilt and receives calm clarity instead, it destabilizes them. Over the following months, Lauren's social confidence dimmed slightly. She wasn't used to resistance. She wasn't used to her framing being questioned in structured environments. She wasn't used to me declining. She had built part of her identity around being the selfless sister. And without the reinforcement of deference, that role felt less secure. At a family gathering in early spring, someone mentioned my recent promotion at work. I hadn't told Lauren directly. She'd heard it through relatives. "That's great," she said politely, then added, "I guess my investment is performing well." A few years ago, I would have laughed immediately. This time, I simply looked at her and said, "I'm proud of the work I've done." The room shifted. Not dramatically, but noticeably. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Because pride, spoken calmly, disrupts indebtedness. Later that evening, I overheard a cousin say to her quietly, "You can't hold that over her forever." Lauren didn't respond. That was the moment I understood the consequences had moved beyond us. When a power imbalance collapses, it forces witnesses to recalibrate too. No one attacked her, no one shamed her, but the unquestioned narrative had cracked. And without that narrative, her leverage weakened. I didn't celebrate that. I didn't feel victorious. I felt something quieter, free. Not from gratitude, but from ownership. And freedom, once experienced, makes returning to silence impossible. The turning point didn't come with anger. It came with urgency. About 8 months after the mediation, Lauren asked to meet again. Not through a mediator, just us. We met at a quiet cafe halfway between our homes, neutral ground. She arrived early this time. Her posture was different. Less polished, less certain. "I think we need to reset," she said after we sat down. Reset. It was an interesting word. It suggested a misunderstanding, a glitch, something accidental. "I'm open to talking," I replied. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup, not drinking it. "I feel like I lost my sister over this," she said. "Over money." I let the sentence sit. "This wasn't about money," I said calmly. "Then what was it about?" she asked. "Control," I thought. But I didn't say that. It was about autonomy, I answered instead. She looked confused. Genuinely confused. I never tried to control you, she said quickly. You may not have experienced it that way, I replied. There was a long pause. She leaned back, exhaling. I just thought, after everything I gave up, there would be acknowledgement. I've acknowledged it, I said. Publicly, privately, for 10 years. That's not what I mean, she insisted. And there it was. What she wanted wasn't gratitude. It was structural superiority, something enduring, tangible, confirmed. The inheritance had represented that confirmation. Without it, the ledger felt unsettled to her. You changed the dynamic, she said quietly. Yes, I agreed. Her eyes searched my face as if trying to locate the version of me she used to navigate. The accommodating one, the deferential one, the sister who absorbed implication without naming it. She says you can't hold that over her forever. I recognized the phrasing, the cousin's voice recycled. Lauren swallowed. People think I'm unreasonable. I haven't said that to anyone, I replied. I know, she said. That almost makes it worse. That sentence stayed with me, because she understood something now. When power is exercised loudly, it invites backlash. When it's exercised subtly and then removed quietly, it leaves a vacuum. She wasn't facing outrage. She was facing reflection. I don't want us to be distant, she said finally. Neither do I answered truthfully. But we can't go back. Her jaw tightened slightly. Why not? Because going back would mean I accept a hierarchy that isn't real. That was the first time I said it plainly. Not accusatory, not heated, just factual. She stared at the table. You really think I saw you as lesser? She asked. I think you saw yourself as owed. The words weren't sharp, but they were final. She didn't argue. Instead, something softer surfaced. Not guilt exactly, but recognition that the narrative she had relied on no longer worked. I didn't realize, she said quietly. I know, I replied. And that was the part that made it too late to fix the old version of us. Because the issue wasn't a single argument. It was 10 years of reinforced roles that had calcified. You can apologize for a sentence. You can't undo a decade of dynamics with one conversation. I don't regret donating, she said suddenly. I'm glad you don't, I answered. And I don't regret surviving, I added. She looked up at that. There was no hostility between us in that moment. Just two women sitting across from each other, realizing that gratitude and ownership had been intertwined for too long. The relationship wasn't broken, but it was different. And different, once accepted, cannot be reversed. The final confrontation didn't feel like a battle. It felt like an audit, not of finances, but of truth. Lauren invited me to her house on a Sunday afternoon. No cafe, no mediator, just her living room, sunlight filtering through half-closed blinds. The kind of setting that usually holds birthday cakes and holiday toasts. This time it held stillness. I've been thinking, she began. I waited. I need to understand something, she said. When did you start pulling away? It wasn't accusatory, it was searching. I didn't pull away, I replied. I stood still. She frowned slightly. That feels the same. It isn't. Silence settled between us. Not tense, just deliberate. For years, she continued carefully. I thought I was protecting you. Making sure you were okay. Making sure you didn't forget what we went through. I didn't forget, I said. I lived it. She nodded once. I guess I thought that gave me a say. In what? In your choices, your proximity, your priorities. There it was. Not wrapped in jokes, not softened by wine glasses and laughter. Direct? A say isn't the same as authority, I answered. Her lips pressed together. I never asked you to repay me, she said. No, I agreed. You didn't ask, you implied. The words weren't sharp, but they were precise. She inhaled slowly. Maybe I didn't know the difference. That's fair, I said. The room felt lighter after that. Not because we agreed, but because nothing was hidden. I built part of my identity around saving you, she admitted. I know! And when you stopped orbiting me, she continued, choosing her words carefully, I felt like something was taken. I didn't take anything, I said gently. I reclaimed something. Another pause. Do you resent me? She asked. It was the first emotionally vulnerable question she had asked since all of this began. No, I said truthfully. I resented the dynamic, not you. She absorbed that. I don't want to lose you over this, she said. You're not losing me, I replied. You're just not owning me. That sentence landed softly, not as an attack, as clarification. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The air wasn't heavy anymore. It was sober. Can we rebuild? She asked. Yes, I said, but it has to be equal. She nodded slowly. Equal, a word we had used for months, but meant differently. This time it meant something simple. 2 adults, 1 act of sacrifice, 0 ownership. The conversation ended without hugs that fixed everything, without tears, without dramatic reconciliation, just mutual recognition. We weren't the same sisters we had been 10 years ago, but maybe that was the point, because survival changes you, and so does clarity. I used to introduce myself as someone who had been saved. Now I introduce myself as someone who survived. There's a difference. For a long time, my identity had an asterisk beside it. A quiet footnote that said, because of her. Not malicious, not cruel, just ever present. Now that footnote is gone. Lauren and I still speak. Not daily, not with forced enthusiasm, but steadily. The tone is different. Lighter, in a way that surprised both of us. Without the invisible ledger running beneath our conversations, there's less tension. When she tells the transplant story now, it's shorter, simpler. She doesn't joke about ownership anymore. She doesn't frame it as lifelong leverage, and I don't flinch when she speaks. We're both learning. The inheritance issue has faded into administrative history. The assets are settled. The paperwork was filed. The house is mine. My accounts are mine. My career trajectory is mine. But more importantly, my decisions are mine. That doesn't mean I'm ungrateful. Every morning, I still see the faint scar on my abdomen. I still attend my annual transplant checkups. I still wear the silver bracelet, not as a symbol of debt, but as a reminder of resilience. Gratitude, I've learned, can be wholehearted without being self-erasing. I don't owe my sister obedience. I owe her honesty. And I owe myself autonomy. That distinction reshaped everything. At work, I find myself more assertive. Not aggressive, just clear. In friendships, I'm more present because I'm not subconsciously managing an imbalance elsewhere. In romantic relationships, I no longer accept subtle hierarchies disguised as devotion. Boundaries in one place teach boundaries everywhere. Sometimes people ask whether I would do anything differently. No, because if I had confronted Lauren explosively at the first joke, we would have fought about tone instead of truth. If I had surrendered part of my inheritance to keep the peace, the hierarchy would have calcified permanently. If I had retaliated or humiliated her, the relationship would have fractured beyond repair. Instead, I chose something quieter. Documentation, clarity, calm repetition of facts. I didn't defeat her. I dismantled a narrative. And in doing so, I dismantled the smaller version of myself that had lived inside it. The most surprising part is this. Once the hierarchy dissolved, I stopped feeling fragile. Not physically, that strength returned years ago. But structurally, there's a steadiness that comes from knowing your existence is not collateral. From knowing that survival doesn't mean surrender. I am not the sister who was saved. I am the woman who lived. And that difference changes how I stand in every room. There's something people don't talk about enough. When someone saves your life, the world expects you to shrink a little in response, to soften your edges, to defer more quickly, to accept imbalance as proof of gratitude. But survival is not a lifelong contract. It's a second beginning. For 10 years, I confused appreciation with permission. I believed that honoring my sister's sacrifice meant minimizing my own autonomy. I thought peace required compliance. It didn't. Peace required clarity. The truth is, my sister did something extraordinary. She gave part of her body so I could keep living. That act deserves respect. It deserves acknowledgement. But it does not grant ownership. Love offered freely cannot later become leverage without transforming into something else. And here's what I've learned. Gratitude is healthiest when it flows forward, into how you live, how you care for others, how you value your second chance. It becomes unhealthy when it flows backward, into self-erasure, silence, or submission. I didn't win anything by standing my ground. I didn't beat my sister. What I gained was something quieter. The ability to look at myself without feeling indebted for existing. Lauren and I are still rebuilding, carefully, honestly. Not as hero and beneficiary, not as savior and survivor, as equals. And equality, once established, feels lighter than obligation ever did. If you've ever felt like you owed someone your future because of something they did for you in the past, I want you to consider this. Is your gratitude empowering you or shrinking you? Where is the line between appreciation and ownership in your life? I'd really like to hear your thoughts.
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.